I'm Howard Lerner. I'm the Director of the Environmental Law and Policy Center. And ELPC Thinks is where we bring together experts, environmental leaders, and community partners to forge new strategies for progress. Quick heads up, we're recording this webinar and streaming live on Facebook so we can share it with those folks who can't join us today. And today, we're honored to have Dan Egan join us. As many of you know, Dan's a two-time Pulitzer Prize finalist, longtime reporter for the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel, the author of Death and Life of the Great Lakes. Dan is currently the Brico Fund Journalist in Residence at the University of Wisconsin Center for Water Policy. He's covered the Great Lakes since 2003, and we're going to have a bit of a conversation. Anytime you'd like to ask a question, click the Q&A icon on your screen, type it in. We'll try to make this work as well as we can over time, okay? So let's go. And Dan, thank you so much for joining us today. We appreciate it. And you know you have a lot of people here who are very interested to hear what you're talking about. You've literally written the book on climate change in the Great Lakes. And we know climate change has started pushing up Lake Michigan water levels to what is uncharted territory as rain, snowfall, evaporation are transformed by the warming climate. We're going to be seeing more extreme lake levels. The higher levels are going to be higher, the lower levels are going to be lower. And already the swings between the two, this is more than recorded history. So I'll give you the softball opener here. What's the big problem here? And what does this mean for lakefront cities like Chicago, Milwaukee, Cleveland, Detroit, the other big Midwestern cities that are on the shores of the lakes?
Well, I don't know if that's a softball because there's a lot of problems and they're all related. But I mean, I think it really comes down to the idea that we built these cities, and let's talk about Chicago specifically for the moment, at least, with the idea that the lakeshore would stay in place. And our concept of where that lakeshore of in place for that lakeshore is fixed on very little data, really only going back to the mid 1800s, and the lake has fluctuated a lot more in the centuries before that than what we've seen. So we're kind of in a fix, you know, unlike the coasts, the ocean coasts. The shoreline is going to change, the ocean is going to rise, but it's happening almost predictably. It's happening slowly, incrementally, and it's going in one direction. So there can be something of an orderly retreat, where Chicago's got to deal with the idea that they may see a lake, you guys may have a lake 6 feet, 7 feet higher than you've ever seen in the coming decades. And you also may have a lake 6 or 7 feet lower. And how you manage for that is a real bugaboo. And the answer to it, I don't know.
All right. So obvious question. What are some of the things we can start doing about it? We've identified the problem. Obviously, climate change is continuing. We need to do a lot to mitigate climate change, but we're not going to turn it around immediately. And during COVID-19, Mother Nature hasn't taken a pause. We're looking at climate change problems accelerating. We've seen the weather this past summer. So what are the things that the mayors of Chicago and Milwaukee and Cleveland should start thinking about? What should they start doing? What should our legislators do? You know, what are the 1, 2, 3, top things as far as you see it?
Yeah, that was kind of the hell of the story that I did just this previous July, because there's not a lot of answers in it. It raises more issues and questions. And I guess the first thing I'd do if I were mayor of Chicago is start thinking about imagining a lake being 3 feet higher than its all-time record high, and look at what are the consequences for that in terms of managing wastewater, of fortifying shorelines, of keeping drinking water systems running smoothly. And the old saying that you plan for these things on a dry day. And I think that it's not just Chicago, it's everyone in the Great Lakes. They're basically hoping that, and we're going to talk about Lake Michigan and Huron specifically, they're one body of water, and they're hoping that that body of water will stay within its 6-foot bracket. It's always been within 3 feet of its all-time high or 3 feet of its all-time low. And looking at what's been happening just in terms of precipitation, there's no reason to expect that is going to be the case going forward. And then there's also, the problem with evaporation tied to ice levels, which is tied to, destabilization of the Arctic air flows, the polar vortex, it's called. These are factors that we can't really account for, but we can start thinking about, what do we do? Once you get to that point, that's what the Army Corps of Engineers is or should exist for, just to be thinking about. And I know they are. I mean, I know there's some early planning going on, but this stuff can happen fast. I mean, Lake Michigan went up 6 feet. Was it 6 feet in 7 years? Faster than anybody had ever seen. There's nothing saying that it had to stop when it got right, it was kissing the high end of the record. It could have gone another foot. And then what would have happened? It would have been problematic. And it's safe to assume that at some point, just look at decades. If it went up six feet in 7 years, what could it do in 7 decades?
Dan, 3 of the things that we've been saying at ELPC, the mayors and the legislators need to start focusing on, and quickly. One of the challenges, the Army Corps of Engineers, you're right, has to be involved. The Army Corps of Engineers is not known as acting quickly. It tends to be pretty slow and methodical. But here are 3 things that we're looking at. I'd be interested in your reactions that the cities can and should be doing. Number 1, cities need to reassess their land use and zoning laws when it comes to along the shoreline. Whatever's being built there under current zoning has to be looked at differently in terms of what the water levels are likely to be. Somebody has a high-rise proposal that's right on an area that's likely to be flooded. Well, you can't base that on yesterday's zoning. You need to make decisions based on what the reality today is of the water levels. Second, we need to look at situations of highly radioactive spent nuclear fuel rods that are stored along the lakeshore, along Lake Michigan, also Lake Huron. We need to look at chemical facilities that have toxics there. We need to look at landfills that are being proposed or historically have been along the lake, and ask the question of, are they built to withstand much higher water levels? And if they're not, we need to get those toxics and the radioactive materials into a place that's far safer than what we think the lake levels are likely to be. Third point, in terms of looking at it, we need to think about community planning and energy development different. We need to recognize that water levels going up and down have impacts upon both the streets and upon the electricity system. And if the system is designed for, as you put it, the dry level that we had in the past, but not for the wet level going forward, we need to change that now. And that's a more distributed microgrid system, so that if one piece fails, everything doesn't collapse. So those are 3 that at the Environmental Law and Policy Center we've been focusing on. I'd be interested in your reaction on those and see if that maybe teases out a 4th or 5th to you.
Yeah, I mean, looking, the first thing, the land use and zoning issues. I don't know how many people participating in this today saw that New York Times story that ran back in early July, but there's a video shot of, can't remember, is the neighborhood South Shore? Is that what it's called?
Could well be, yeah.
Yeah, and there was it looks like an apartment building, but it's actually quite a large house. There were waves taking furniture out of that house. I mean, they came right through the living room window, and you look at that and you think, what is that house doing there? And I guess you can extrapolate from there and say, well, what's the city doing there? We got a city, we've got to deal with it. But the first thing, land use and zoning, yeah, don't exacerbate it. Don't put more people in peril by building right on the edge of a great unknown. Because that's what was one thought that kept echoing in my head when I was writing this story. It's not a great lake, it's a great unknown right now.
Dan, and on that one, sometimes people look at this as a north side or south side issue in Chicago. The last time we had the big floodings about 1.5 years, 2 years ago, The same situation, same problem, both on the south side between 71st Street and 75th Street, flooding of apartment buildings that are built right on the lake. Same thing on the north side up in Rogers Park. Same problem, beaches and apartment buildings built right on the lake, major flooding problems. The fact is we need to think about existing development and new development differently in light of what we're learning now about the water levels, which is exactly your point.
Yes, yes, absolutely. And then as far as like the toxic materials and the radioactive materials, yeah, I didn't even touch that when I got into this climate change and Chicago's vulnerabilities story last summer, because it's its own story. And I haven't done a lot of research on it myself. I don't know, what the flashpoints or what the triggering point for a real crisis could be for some of these facilities holding that spent fuel. But yeah, I mean, when you're talking about strategizing and doing what we can now, absolutely, start looking at this and get some sense of what the odds are, and then make a rational choice. And there's nothing more difficult than moving spent fuel rods across the continent. I used to live in Idaho, and I remember when a lot of them were going out there, it was hugely controversial. But worse than that is doing it on some kind of a half-baked basis because the water's coming. And so yeah, those two. And then as far as the community planning, yeah, so we're talking about high water right now, but 7 years ago we were talking about low water. And I remember that I think there were drinking water issues in Milwaukee and I believe Chicago, potential issues. I mean, those intakes need to be at a certain depth for a certain temperature. So, they're getting a good clean pulse of water into the system. And yeah, if, like I said earlier, we could go way higher in 7 decades, or we could go way lower. And these are not what if problems, really. They're more like when problems. So I would say that those three prongs that you just described that's where I would start if I was thinking about this in that way.
And your New York Times piece also brought a focus on environmental justice issues. Lower income communities of color have borne a disproportionate impact of pollution over the years. How do we bring a greater understanding to those issues? Is it through the maps and the visuals that accompanied your article in the New York Times? How do we get people to recognize the very particular disproportionate impact on this on lower income communities?
Well, when we say we, I guess I'll say I, like as a member of the media, we
Fair enough.
Need to give voice, to those people in those neighborhoods. And I'll be honest, when I started writing this, like any reporter, what you start doing is reading what's been written about it previously. And there had been some coverage of what was going on the South Side, some excellent coverage by some outlets, but it was largely a story about what was happening in, say, Rogers Park. I mean, that's the first place I went, and I worked on that story for about 10 months. So I was down in Rogers Park around this time last year. And, it took more research and more thinking and more conversations with the editors at the paper to realize that that's a well-told story. And we do need to give voice to the other side of town. And, what's interesting is my first round of interviews, can't remember the name of the building, but it had the exact address as a building that we featured in the story itself on the South Side. There are actually siblings who lived in each building, which is really weird. But yeah, there's a symmetry to the problem, and I don't think that that's been recognized. And when I say symmetry, I mean there's just as much exposure on the South Side. In some cases, it's worse because, say, downtown was raised, and they can move water out of there more easily than some of these lower lying neighborhoods that never got the sewer upgrades that other places did. So the water, it's not so much the lake coming at the towns, it's more the sky coming at the towns and the pipes not being able to handle it. And it is heartbreaking to talk to these people who just they live with it like a chronic condition. And like anybody, you get optimistic if you go 2 years and you think, all right, let's put the television down in the basement along with some carpeting. We've had 2 good years, and inevitably, it gets hit with, it's not just water, it's sewage. And so, yeah, I mean, I think the first step is to give voice to those people, but then to also look at equity and see, and I'm not in a position here to start critiquing on what the sewerage district is putting in and where and how that's affecting this side of town or that side of town. But clearly there's a sentiment on the south side that they've been left out. And I think all those basements that get flooded and all that junk that ends up on the streets and in the alleys of those neighborhoods tells the story better than I can right now.
The point is absolutely true with regard to the south side. And interestingly, Rogers Park is one of the most diverse communities in Chicago. I looked at the data, say a month ago. My recollection is it's about 58% people of color. It's about 42% white. It's really a very diverse community. So you're seeing that both south side and north side. Do you think our state and local leaders, the mayors, the senators, the state senators, state legislators, state reps, do they get it? I mean, is your sense that they get that there's a real problem here and they're not quite ready to address it? Or they just don't quite get yet what the science is and what the experience is?
I don't think they get the idea that the lake can behave dramatically or drastically different than it has any time in the last 2 centuries. In the 1600s, I'm going from memory here, but I think the lake was like 2.5 feet higher. Now, when you guys had those storms, series of storms in May 2020, the deep tunnel and the reservoirs did their job with the first, it was around May 17th to May 20th or something. The infrastructure built since the 1970s did its job. It caught a lot of water, but those tunnels and those reservoirs were still holding that water when that second round of rain came in. And that's when they, turned to reversing the river. And that's when they found they couldn't reverse the river because the lake was too high. So if they would have opened the gates at Navy Pier, that just would have unleashed the lake on downtown rather than letting the river flow out into the lake. So they had to wait for the Willis Tower basement to be flooded and Lower Wacker Drive and the Riverwalk. All of that was just submerged and, nobody had experienced that. Now I bring that up because imagine if the lake were 2 feet higher at that point. Put 2 more feet there and just let your mind run wild. And if you really want to let your mind run wild, they did some radiocarbon dating of ancient shorelines back in the, oh gosh, I think it was like 3,000 years ago, 4,000 years ago, which is obviously ancient history, but really people were still walking around the Great Lakes at that point, and the lakes were like 9 feet higher than their long-term average. And so we are at their mercy, and the politicians and the planners of today, I think, know that on some level, but it's a big abstract problem right now, and there are a lot of other problems that they are appropriately dealing with, but they need to think more about it. And again, you start planning for this stuff when it isn't a crisis, because if it comes fast and hard and we haven't armored ourselves in some fashions, I don't know.
Dan, we're going to open this up for questions in a minute because I know there are a lot of questions for you, but just to wrap it up, what gives you hope? What is it that when you look at this, you say, all right, I'm just not completely down in the dumps.
Yeah, well,
we might as well go fishing.
Right, well,
what gives you hope?
We're all gonna die, right? That doesn't mean that you don't try to, stay healthy. I'd like to eat corned beef every night, but I'm not going to, even though I know I'm gonna die at some point. And I think we don't know what's gonna happen in 30 or 40 years, but we have to think about the people, not just the city, but the people who are gonna be there in 30, 40, 50, 70, 100 years. And I guess what would give me hope is the idea that we get a little pass to date, I think, because the effects of climate change have been largely an abstraction. Well, that's summer 2021 is changing that really fast. And I think now we have a responsibility to start taking some steps, whatever they may be. So the optimist in me is that I live my life trying to think about what am I doing and how's it going to affect my kids and my grandkids and so on. And so that's just, the role that a responsible human should take. And so I don't think the wise tack at this point would be to say, what the hell, let's just let it play out. It's not our problem. Well, you know, on a real intimate level, it is, because it's our kids' future.
All right. Let's be hopeful. I'm a half, glass is half full sort of guy. Not a bad analogy to use for water. So let's see if we can turn to some of the questions that people are asking here. A question from Tim about the United States in general has trouble with long-term planning. How do we deal with these issues that aren't just simply a react to disaster mentality? Is there enough sort of education along the way we can do that, you know, sort of gets us out of the just wait till the disaster comes? What do you think?
Well, yeah, and I do think that this is a watershed moment, if you will, given what's been happening with the storms and the fires and the extreme temperatures. I mean, it's no longer an abstraction, and we have to respond appropriately. So we're entering a new era where this isn't a what if, you know, scenario, and people know that. How we go forward, though, that's I don't know. I give me 10 months and all the resources of the New York Times behind me, and I could look into this and come back with a much better, more intelligent answer. But right now, I just think that we've got to just think about what's happened over the last 6 months and think about the future in that context.
A question Faye Sinnott has about, and some other folks have about, is Michigan DNR or Illinois DNR, are they notifying communities about water allotments being reduced? Or is there going to be more water? And that's going to be up.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. You know, it is interesting to think about how, you know, it's so cyclical and it comes up every 10 or 15 years. But, you know, now the West is once again eyeing the Great Lakes. And, you know, some people think it could be, you know, a double-headed solution. It can help us manage some of our excess water. And I guess I would define excess as anything that's in somebody's basement or building. But that's not going to be a long-term answer for the West or for us. As far as allotments, I'm not sure what the DNRs are doing in the various states. Obviously, right now, water, with the exception of some communities right outside the Great Lakes Basin, water shortages aren't a real big issue in the Great Lakes today.
Sharon Fagan, who's worked on these issues for years, is asking, is there really, Dan, no predictable pattern to the highs and lows? Or is there some sort of cycle here over 30 years in which hydrologists and others can, to some degree, predict when we're going to have relatively higher, when we're going to have lower water levels? Or is it just all up in the air right now? What do you think?
Well, clearly there's a rhythm to the historical fluctuations of the lakes. And let's talk about Lake Michigan and Huron specifically. I mean, it's almost like looking at an EKG. It's down and up and down and up. What's different now is I mean, we could get into just, you know, the whole equation of what drives lake levels, but real simply, it's evaporation, precipitation, and outflows, and hopefully they all match up. And in recent years, we've been getting way more precipitation than normal, and yet we were still at almost a record low, and that's because we were getting increased evaporation at the same time. Well, once the polar vortex winters set in and we took that extra evaporation off the table, the lake skyrocketed. And if you look at a graph, you know, without too fine of resolution, it is their heartbeats. Well, if you look at this with a little more focus, you can see what happened in 6 years has never happened before. The fact that the lake went from a record low 2013 to within an inch or so of its all-time record high, 6 foot difference. In the past, that would take a couple decades to happen. This happened in 6 years. And so just look at the amount of rain we're getting. You know, the precipitation's going up, evaporation's going up. And as long as they're going up in tandem, things should be okay. But there's no reason to expect that they will, because we have suffered these destabilized Arctic blasts, or these polar vortex blasts of cold weather in winters, 3 of the last 6 years or so. And, you know, there's talk of another one coming this winter. So yeah, you can take some comfort in the fact, looking back and seeing that it's rhythmic, and, you know, the lake's always fluctuated. But if you look at what's driving these numbers today, they're different than they were 10 years ago. And that's what the hydrologists like Drew Gronwald at the University of Michigan can speak to very eloquently.
You know, we've spent a lot of time working together with Drew Grunwald, who's just terrific on these issues and very knowledgeable. One key point, it's not just the water levels, it's the wind.
Yes.
It's when you have high water levels that get combined with high winds that really push the waves and the water up the beach. So wind plus water, not just water alone. Drew's point, which I think both of us agree with. Elizabeth Kinney's asking, do people need to be moved out of their current homes? Is this one of the things that, you know, like we're seeing out west, there are areas that are just extraordinarily prone to wildfires, and, you know, you sort of know it's coming, and we need to plan a little differently? Or is there a way of engineering around that?
You know, they've talked about building structures out in the lake to you know, push back on these surges that you were just talking about. But, you know, I think the flooding crisis, if you will, that could hit Chicago isn't going to be like a dam broke and people are going to, you know, be on the second story of their homes waiting for a helicopter to come rescue them. I think it's just going to be, it's going to happen, like I said earlier, a lot faster than on the ocean coast as far as the long-term increase or a sustained increase. But I don't think evacuating people from their homes today is the answer. I think if you want what the answer is going to be, look at what the insurance companies do.
Yeah, you know, that's exactly right, Dan. One of the points that just keeps coming up is when our insurance company is going to, in effect, pull the plug and say, we've seen this area flood twice, we see what's likely to happen, and either we're not insuring it anymore or your rates are going way up. I mean, that's going to be, I think, a very critical private market, if you will, part of the incentives that operate. Jerome McDonnell asks about your piece in the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel advocating for reversing the Chicago River. Can you talk a little bit about that? How does that help with climate change?
Sure. And, you know, it's been a while since I wrote that piece, and I don't know if I necessarily advocated for it. I advocated for the idea of exploring it. But yeah, you know, that issue isn't just about Asian carp or invasive species either. It's about water management and how we choose to use, you know, this fresh water. And right now we're using it to move sewage, and we're moving it away from the lake, which is effluent. We're moving it away from the lake, which is something that I think people appreciate, but it comes with consequences downstream. And I also think this isn't 1900 anymore. We don't need to use Lake Michigan as a big, you know, tank to flush the bowl. There are technologies where Chicago could be using its water and returning it to the lake. How that fits in with climate change, you know, that everything goes off the table when you put 5 more feet of water in Lake Michigan or out of Lake Michigan. You know, that the whole system is, again, it goes back to, it's premised on the lake staying where it was. And back in 2013, they were within like less than a foot, maybe 6 inches of the lake being so low that the river was going to reverse itself. And so, I mean, there's pumping and there's strategies to address that to a degree, but you drop another foot or two and it's a big problem. And that really is, for me, what's unique about Chicago is its water system and its reliance on gravity to get the bad stuff out of town.
A couple of comments people have made about, you know, Erica Chavez's comment, the shortage scarcity can still be experienced by people, even if there's an abundance of water, as a result of shutoffs. couple comments made by people like Gene Weedoff of, okay, what do you tell people who are homeowners in flooded areas to do? You know, you can give them greater awareness of the problem, but what do you say? Any comments you'd have on the shutoffs issue, on the what do you say to people whose homes are in flood prone areas?
Well, I'm a journalist, you know, I'm not a like regulator or a politician. And so it's really, it's not my job to tell people.
Yeah, I'm the policy guy.
Yeah, well, yeah, and it's not a simple answer. And, you know, I think going forward with any of this, it's got to be, things have got to be approached equitably and, you know, in a region-wide fashion. But what's so difficult about this issue is until it really happens, it still is an abstract. And so, you know, we could really target some, you know, vulnerable, exposed communities and do something drastic or significant, whatever word you want to use, something substantial. And then the lake goes down for the next 3 decades, you know, 5 or 6 feet. Well, people aren't going to remember the reason that they did it. They're just going to remember that, or they're going to look at it as a boondoggle. So this is really, it's a real big challenge. And, you know, it's kind of a frustration as a reporter where you write what you know, and you put it out there, and it's like, let other people try to figure it out. But it's only natural that people are going to want answers from somebody like me, and I'm not in a great position to give those good answers.
You know, I'll give one answer to Gene Weedoff's question. There are certain areas that are both shoreline, but also places like Salt Creek in DuPage County. For those of you who are longtime Chicagoans, practically every spring, there's some creeks and rivers in DuPage County that just keep flooding. People's homes are flooded over. You have the terrible human element of people having to escape from their homes in rowboats and sitting on the roof waiting for a rescue. I mean, at some point, we simply need to decide, as has happened in Wisconsin, is happening in Illinois, that places where people built that historically may have been viewed as a 100-year floodplain or not a floodplain at all. Today, in light of climate change and other factors, there's a reality. In Wisconsin near Spring Green, I believe there were 3 floods within 20 years that happened within the so-called 100-year floodplain. The world is changing in this regard, and we simply have to recognize the changing hydrology, the changing climate, and it just doesn't work to say, well, it's supposed to be a 100-year floodplain, or it's not even a floodplain, when today's sound science is, it is. And people then need to make some choices accordingly. As Michael Eber, and you pointed out earlier, Dan, and others have pointed out, the insurance industry is already beginning to deny coverage to people in places because they are grounded in science and actuarial data. That's the changing reality that we're facing. Couple things I'll just summarize here. Tim asked a question about, can we have more sensors in Lake Michigan and the other places in the Great Lakes to monitor water levels, wind, and so forth? Tim, actually NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, really does have a number of sensors and does a fair amount of monitoring. Now, maybe there should be more of it, but that data is stored at the University of Chicago. Incredible amount of data from those sensors. And as a community, we need to figure out better ways of using it. Susan Hedman, Dan asks, and this is a fun question for you. Thank you, Susan. If you were to rank the 5 top problems facing the Great Lakes ecosystem, what would they be? And is water level fluctuation, where is that in the top 5 for you?
Well, I'd lump the fluctuation. Let me keep track here. So come up with 5. The fluctuation with climate change, and yeah, obviously climate change is a big problem. Invasive species, it has been a problem and will continue to be a problem. And you know, we're addressing it better with what we're allowing into the lakes in terms of ocean-going vessels and contaminated ballast water. But the door is still open. That's a very significant one. I think development is always an issue. The legacy piles that you were referring to earlier, the waste, the nuclear waste, and the storage of other bad stuff within, at some point striking distance of the lake would be a big issue. But a real big issue, I think, is phosphorus and just the overdosing of the lakes. We saw the consequences of that real dramatically back in 2014 when the city of Toledo, lost its drinking water supply for a couple of days. And, ever since then, that pollution was coming mostly down the Maumee River near Toledo. And, they're spending ungodly amounts of money on this, yet they're still adding livestock into that watershed, which to me is insane. And so, if we can't do something as obvious as restrict the amount of manure flowing into a river that's poisoning a lake, and we know that that's the source of the problem, I do get a little discouraged, talking about optimism and pessimism. I do get a little discouraged that we're not going to be able to address some more complicated and comprehensive problems tied to climate change. But again, I know you guys have done a lot of work with phosphorus in Lake Erie, and that's a problem that goes beyond Lake Erie and beyond the Great Lakes. It's a national problem, and it's
actually Bay problem. It's a Chesapeake Bay problem. It's a Florida problem.
Yeah,
Colorado River, California,
Mississippi. They had blue-green algae on the coast of Mississippi 2 summers ago. They didn't think that they could. This is a great tie-in with climate change and everything that's going on. They didn't think that a coastal zone could harbor or sustain this microcystis. And there was so much water coming down the Mississippi River that summer because of all the rain, and it essentially turned the coast into fresh water. And so 40 miles of beach in Mississippi was closed for like before the 4th of July through the rest of the summer because the ocean had turned too toxic to swim in. And so, yeah, phosphorus is, potency and problems stretch way beyond the Great Lakes, but the Great Lakes are particularly vulnerable, particularly the southern lakes. Although Lake Superior is getting it.
Steve Tuckey was asking a question about agricultural runoff. Many of you on this call know that the Environmental Law and Policy Center is leading the litigation to clean up Lake Erie. The toxic algae problem in Lake Erie is sort of the poster child for the problems in the country. And the source of it is scientifically established. The Ohio EPA says that 90% of the phosphorus pollution into Western Lake Erie comes from the agricultural sector. Principally, that's manure running off from concentrated animal feeding operations, in effect, cow poop, pig poop, chicken poop, that manure putting phosphorus into Western Lake Erie going through the Maumee River Basin. And the other big component is excess fertilizers, nitrogen fertilizers, running off from soy and corn crop fields. So we know what 90% of the problem is. It's coming from the agricultural sector, according to the Ohio EPA. And the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, Annex 4, has some of the top scientists working on what to do about it. It's been signed by the US EPA. It's been signed by the state of Ohio. It's been signed by Canada. And what it says is we need to reduce phosphorus pollution into Western Lake Erie by 40% by 2025 in order to alleviate the toxic algae outbreaks. So they only occur once in 10 years, as opposed to almost every summer, including this summer. So we know the math. You can't reduce 40% if you don't deal with 90% of the problem. We know the source of the problem, and we're looking at the inability of the state of Ohio to say, hey, when it comes to CAFOs, we got to quit making a bad problem worse by citing more of them. And we need to clean up the amount of fertilizer, reduce the amount of manure that's going into Western Lake Erie. Otherwise, we're going to have toxic algae outbreaks almost every summer. We sued the US EPA to step up and take action where the state of Ohio wasn't. Governor DeWine is committed to achieving the goals of Annex 4, 40% reduction by 2025. but the state just isn't really anywhere to achieving that. So we need to look to our federal government to do what the state government isn't doing. I mean, it's just a regional and a national disgrace that it's not safe for people to swim and fish for walleye, ride in a kayak or in a boat, concerns about safe drinking water in Western Lake Erie. And this is a top voting issue. If you're interested, folks, take a look at the Ann Selzer polling that was done for ELPC in 4 Northwest Ohio counties. Safe, clean water, cleaning up Lake Erie, identified as the top priority issue. More than 80% of the voters in Northwest Ohio. So it's not just an issue of concern to people, it's a voting issue to people. And we're going to see if finally, with the change in administration, if the federal government and the US EPA and the Department of Justice are willing to step up, if the state of Ohio isn't, and we're going to see whether Governor DeWine is going to live up to his commitment and step up to take the necessary steps to reduce phosphorus by at least 40% so we can get a cleaner Lake Erie. But you're absolutely right, Dan. It's not just Lake Erie, even in the Great Lakes. The same problem emerging in Green Bay, emerging in the other shallow water bays of the lake. Anything you want to add on the phosphorus issue? Because I know it's something that you're thinking about maybe as a next story or something.
Yeah, no, I'm actually working on a book, a whole book about phosphorus. That's being done by the Great Lakes book. It's the same publisher, same editor. And so hopefully that'll see the light of day at some point. But yeah, talking about optimism and pessimism again, you're talking about we know what the problem is in Lake Erie, we know how to fix it, and we just aren't. Well, look at what a previous generation did for us with Lake Erie back in the 1970s, when they recognized what Lake Erie, had phosphorus or had algae problems back then. And just like today, the best minds got together and they figured out what the problem was, and they basically wrote a prescription. And the difference is back then, we took that advice and we did something about it, and the lake recovered dramatically and quickly. This is more tricky. It's going to take longer, and we're not going to see the dramatic cleanup, but we can't just keep going backwards. You talk about trying to get it down to 1 in every 10 years. It is so predictable right now. It's like foliage. And, they're actually, I'm sure many people on this Zoom are familiar with the annual prediction of how bad the bloom's going to be. It's done in Western Lake Erie every early July. And I remember I was at one of these events the summer before last, and they were talking about, we're going to tackle this through the 4 R's, better farming practices, basically. Nobody in the room talked about that. That very week, I think they added 4,000 pigs, permit for 4,000 pig operation in the Maumee Basin. So we can't go forward if we keep taking these backward steps. So
exactly. A lot of folks have been calling for a moratorium on more CAFOs, and that's really necessary at this point, because otherwise, as you put it, you can't go forward if you keep going backward. We can't keep making a bad problem worse. Couple of questions, Dan, while we have just a few more minutes. Nick Rabkin's asking questions from Elizabeth Kinney. Progress toward dealing with zebra mussels, other invasive species. Do you see this as something that we're making progress to solving, Asian carp, or is it just getting worse? What do you think?
Well, yes and no. I mean, I think with zebra and their closely related cousins, quagga mussels, things are in places getting better because, nature is resilient, and we're seeing on Lake Huron and to a significant degree on Lake Michigan, the whole fishery adjusting to, the fact that most of the energy, the biomass in the lake is tied up in these mussels, but we're seeing native fish figuring out how to tap that as a resource. And as a result of that, we're seeing walleye populations and lake trout populations and whitefish populations, all native species, doing better now than they have any time since the mussels came in. And the key is to keep the next whatever it is from coming through those gates at the St. Lawrence, the entrance to the St. Lawrence Seaway in Montreal. I mean, in 1986, nobody heard of zebra mussels. There was actually some debate in Congress about funding for research, and maybe this is apocryphal, but I think it did happen. Somebody chimed in, they were only paying half attention. They said, why are we going to invest any money researching the muscles of zebras? And that just shows you how much ignorance there was. And now everybody, when they think of the Great Lakes, who lives in the Great Lakes, they think of zebra mussels not far behind it. And so the question is, what's the next zebra mussel? What's the next organism that we've never heard about? So we have an obligation to do everything we can to shut that front door on the St. Lawrence Seaway to new invasions. And speaking of Asian carp, on the back door, I like to think of the Seaway as the front door to the Great Lakes and the Chicago area waterway system as the back door. They're both connections that are artificial or man-made to the outside world. And I'm hopeful that they can keep the carp at bay and they'll take the appropriate steps. I don't know how optimistic I am, but again, I said earlier, you got to try.
Business as usual doesn't work. By the way, Dan, everybody should take a look at the chat comments by Jeff Reuter. Jeff Reuter was the lead scientist, as you know, Dan, on the science team that did the work for the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement Annex 4 for the states, the US federal government, the Canadian government, and Ontario on what needed to be done as a matter of sound science to reduce phosphorus pollution sufficient to alleviate the severe recurring toxic algae outbreaks. And Dan and his science team Jeff and his science team are the ones who defined 40% reduction by 2025 is necessary. It's important. Speaking of, between Drew Grunwald on hydrology, Jeff Reuter on what needs to be done for toxic algae outbreaks to alleviate it and clean up Lake Erie, there's really strong scientific expertise here in the Great Lakes region. Folks, there are a lot more questions. We got about 4 minutes before wrapping up. Dan, why don't you add a couple minutes of just however you'd like to close with some overall thoughts, and then I'll do a quick wrap up.
Yeah, I've been covering these issues since 2003, and I do get asked fairly often, like if it's just a depressing job, and I don't think of it as a depressing job at all. I mean, I play a role as educator, I think, as much as anything. I'm not a traditional watchdog reporter. I'm more trying to explain things that are complicated but essential for people to make informed decisions. And the fact that you have as many people signed up for this today, as you had mentioned before we went live, is really encouraging. And, I'm only able to illustrate and expose a problem. After that, it goes to the advocates and the regulators and the politicians. So I'm optimistic as long as people are still paying attention, and I'll leave whatever goes beyond that to the people who are built to do that.
Thank you, Dan Egan, both for joining us today, and thank you for what you're writing, whether it's in your book or your upcoming book or what you've been writing at the Journal Sentinel for years, your piece in the New York Times. That visibility, that bringing information to people is absolutely vital, to spur action. And I think all of you know, ELPC on the action side of it, we've really ramped up the work we're doing across the Great Lakes. And it ranges from the success in getting much more funding through the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. The current bipartisan infrastructure bill has an additional $1 billion for Great Lakes restoration. That's a successful program, the GLRI program that many of us worked hard on, ELPC and our colleagues at Healing Our Waters and the Alliance for Great Lakes. Mentioned before, my colleagues Rob Michaels, John Petoskey, and I are up to our shoulders, I was going to say elbows, in the Lake Erie litigation to clean up Lake Erie and get the federal and state government to do what they need to do to clean it up. And it's not limited in terms of water contamination to just Lake Erie. As Dan points out, we have problems and issues with CAFOs in Ohio. We're doing cases in Michigan, also cases in Wisconsin. We got to get the policies better and right. Otherwise, you can't move forward if you keep going backwards with more pollution. And Jill Geiger and her team is working a lot on shoreline issues, the beginning of the conversation we had with Dan about what can be done with land use and zoning. What can we do to make sure that if there are toxic materials or radioactive materials along the shoreline, that we are highly confident that there are really strong assurances that they're set back far enough so that if the water levels are expectedly much higher with wind whipping it up, that we're not looking at a disaster. Let's do what we need to do to stop that from happening. And how do we engage our state and local officials to think about it and act on it now, not do as one of the commenters said, wait for the disaster to happen and then react later. We're doing a lot on this. Check out the ELPC website. Thank you all for joining us today, and thank you for what many of you are doing to protect and preserve the Great Lakes. And thanks again, Dan Egan, for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Take care, folks. Talk with you soon.